Hello, I'm David Stoddard. I'm an attorney and I'm speaking to you from my office in Anderson, South Carolina. I'm often asked by people, what is my case worth, or how much would be a fair settlement in my case? And they tell me a little bit about their injury and want to know, well, how much money should I ask for, or what would be fair in my case? If this is your question, that's what I made this video about. I can't really give you a figure for your specific case. And in fact, usually when people ask me to answer that question for them, they don't give me enough information for me to possibly answer that question. But I can give you some things that you should be thinking about when you're trying to decide what would be a fair settlement in my case. You may even determine after listening to this video that maybe you should get a lawyer involved. Maybe you can settle it yourself if that's what you're trying to do. In thinking about what would be a fair settlement in your case, first you need to understand special damages and intangible damages. And then we're going to talk about the severity of your injury and the duration of your injury. And then a big factor, unfortunately, is how much insurance coverage there is. And then another factor, if it's a wreck case, is how much damage was done to your car. So we'll discuss all these issues. Now, special damages are fairly easy to ascertain. You simply add up your medical bills, you figure out what your average weekly wage would be, or your average weekly earnings potential if you were between jobs at the time of the accident, and you multiply that by the number of weeks that you lost from work based on the accident. Now, sometimes lost wages get to be a little bit more speculative because you may have future lost wages. It's even more speculative when you're not totally disabled, permanently totally disabled, but you have diminished earnings capacity. Perhaps you were making $15 an hour as a construction worker at the time of the accident, and now you can't do construction work anymore, and you're going to be relegated to minimum wage type work. Well, in that case, you simply determine how much your earnings capacity has gone down, and you multiply that into the future. But it's still math, so it's the cost of medical treatment and lost wages. Now, I say it's easy to ascertain this. There may be some disagreement with the insurance company on the other side. They may say some of that medical treatment was unnecessary. They may say that even though you had a medical problem that needed that treatment, we didn't cause your medical problem. This often happens with back injuries where the adjuster will say, well, we didn't cause your bad back. You had it all along. They may question your lost wages and say, well, we didn't cause all these problems that caused you to be out of work. But still, it's easy to at least add up medical bills and determine lost wages. Intangible damages are pain and suffering, loss of quality of life, those sorts of issues. These are intangible damages, and they're harder to put a number on than the special damages that we talked about earlier. How does one determine what would be a reasonable amount for pain and suffering and loss of quality of life? Well, you want to look at the severity of your injury and the duration of your injury. By severity, I mean how bad is the pain and how much does it interfere with your ability to do things. Some injuries are mild, there's not much pain. They really don't interfere with your ability to do things. Some injuries, for example, you can continue doing your job. You don't even have to miss work. It's just a little bit of aggravation. Some injuries are very severe. The pain is so pervasive it's hard to think of anything else. It's hard to sleep at night. Some injuries cause a lot of loss of function in lifting, pushing, pulling, these kinds of things. Some injuries keep you from engaging in activities you used to engage in. Some injuries prevent you from working. So this is what I mean by severity. The next question is, what is the duration of the injury? Is the injury temporary or is it permanent? Often the injuries resolve within 3 to 6 months. Some of them even last a year, but then they resolve. That's a temporary injury. A permanent injury, of course, is an injury that you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life. Often when people come to me and say, this is what happened to me, I have a hurt back, what would be a fair settlement in my case? They don't even know if their injury is temporary or permanent at this point because they're still treating by their physician. This brings up an important medical legal term called maximum medical improvement. Sometimes we refer to this as MMI. Maximum medical improvement means that your injury is stabilized, and further medical treatment is not going to make it any better. You may have to go back to the doctor from time to time, but further medical treatment is not going to improve it. You're at maximum medical improvement. Once you've reached MMI, if your injury is completely healed, you're back 100%, then that means your injury was temporary. Once you've reached MMI, if you still have pain, if you still have loss of function, if you're having trouble engaging in daily activities, then that's a permanent injury. So you really can't begin assessing your case. You can't begin trying to settle your case till you've reached MMI. Now, how do you use the severity of your injury and the duration of your injury to determine what will be a fair settlement? Well, if you have a mild injury that's temporary, then you're talking about very little for pain and suffering. In some cases, you may not be entitled to any pain and suffering. Usually, though, you're talking about seeking in the thousands of dollars, something less than $10,000 perhaps, for pain and suffering. Now, if you have an injury that is permanent, yet it's somewhat mild, you could be talking about pain and suffering in the tens of thousands of dollars. Without having more details, I can't tell you whether it should be $10,000 or $50,000, but that's kind of the range you're probably talking about. Now, if you have an injury that is severe and it's permanent, then your pain and suffering you may be talking about in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, again, you might be talking about $100,000, or it could be in the range of $1 million. $1 million settlements are somewhat rare. They're not unheard of. Now, I mentioned insurance coverage as being an important factor. Sometimes this is the most important factor. Unfortunately, even if you have a permanent injury that's severe, you're limited in what you can recover by the amount of insurance coverage. In many cases, especially car wrecks, the at-fault driver only has $25,000 of available insurance coverage. This may be all you can ever get from your case. Some cases, especially if it's a trucking company or corporation that is at fault and caused your injury, insurance coverage may not even be a factor. They may have millions of insurance coverage. If you have a case where there's only $25,000 of insurance coverage, there's no point in trying to pump up your damages to hundreds of thousands of dollars because you'll probably never recover it. If you have a situation where you have a serious injury and you suspect there may not be enough insurance coverage, then it's important for you to try to make sure you find all the coverage that's available. One thing that you have to do is to contact your insurance agent and get your insurance declarations page. And the coverage that you want to look for is UIM coverage. That's known as underinsured motorist coverage. And that covers you if your damages exceed the at-fault party's insurance coverage. If you were involved in an automobile accident and you suspect there's inadequate insurance coverage, you may also want to look at whether a road defect or a defect in maintenance of the road contributed to the accident. You may want to think about whether your car was sufficiently crash-worthy. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One will be a road defect. You've probably seen roads where they've been repaved or recapped with asphalt, and there's a drop-off from the paved portion of the road to the shoulder of the road. Well, if that drop-off exceeds about, I think, 4 inches, that's a dangerous condition. One thing that happens, a very common accident, is where someone goes off the right side of the road and then they overcorrect going into oncoming traffic. Well, if there's a fairly large drop-off from the pavement to the shoulder, that is a known dangerous condition because the tendency is there's resistance when you're trying to get back on the road, and it causes this overcorrecting. Now, that may be an example where the government entity responsible for maintaining the road was negligent and could have contributed to your accident. One type of crashworthiness case is when you have a rollover and the roof of the car kind of caves in. Some vehicles do not have enough structural integrity in the roof to sustain a rollover type accident, and there are standards for how much pressure these vehicles are to take, and there have been successful lawsuits for lack of crashworthiness of some vehicles. One other important factor in automobile accident cases is how much damage was done to your car. If you have what we sometimes refer to as soft tissue injuries, that is, you don't have broken bones, herniated discs, you don't need surgery, sometimes it's difficult to convince a jury that you have a real injury if there's very little damage to the car. Insurance adjusters really emphasize this. In fact, I think insurance adjusters overemphasize this and make a bigger deal of this than it really is. But it is true that it's sometimes difficult to convince jurors that you have a real injury, and that can affect the value of your case. It certainly affects what kind of settlement you can get from the insurance company, because they're very stingy about offering money on soft tissue injuries where there was apparently low impact to the car, very little damage to the car. So let me summarize what we've talked about. If you're trying to decide what would be a fair settlement in your case, the first place you start is your special damages, your medical bills and lost wages. Then you want to look at pain and suffering and loss of quality of life. And the real question there is, how severe is your injury? How does it interfere with your life? And is it permanent? Then, of course, you have to consider your insurance coverage, and if it's a wreck case, how much damage was done to the vehicle. If you have other questions about personal injury, feel free to call my office or visit my website, because we have additional information on our website.